this episode, we will examine the prophecy of Christ's virgin birth, as quoted by Bob Dutko, evangelical Christian radio talk show host and apologist, as evidence that the Bible is true.
It was prophesied that he would be born of a virgin. Isaiah 7:14 says, "And therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us.
And where is their confirmation that this biblical prediction came true?
And we, of course, read in Luke 1 that he was born of a virgin.
No evidence exists that the passage from Isaiah 7 was ever read to mean a virgin would conceive of a male offspring prior to its use by the authors of Matthew and Luke. The Hebrew word in the verse is alma, and simply refers to a young woman of marriageable age, a woman who would have been a virgin prior to the conception of her first child. However, the authors of Matthew and Luke were writing in Greek, and the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible available to them was the Septuagint. The authors of the Septuagint tended to translate loosely and to translate each word individually, not always in context. So the translators of the Greek Septuagint, the version the author of Matthew clearly consulted when writing his gospel, mistakenly translated the Hebrew alma for the Greek parthenos. Parthenos generally refers merely to a young girl of marriageable age, but also carries with it the distinction of a virgin. In the ancient world, as noted by Hebrew scholar Joel Hoffman, most young women were virgins, and most virgins were young women. The situation is similar to teenagers and high school students in America. By and large, teenagers today are in high school, and high schoolers are in their teens, though the fact that college usually begins around age 18 makes the comparison imperfect. Still, it wouldn't be a terrible translation mistake to change "he saw a group of 10 teenagers" into "he saw a group of 10 high school students." Similarly, it wasn't usually a terrible gaffe to use virgin for a young woman, and Isaiah 7:14 isn't the only place we find this error in the Septuagint. For example, in Genesis 24:16, Rebekah is described in Hebrew as a young woman who was a virgin. In Greek, she is described twice as parthenos, yielding the somewhat odd "a virgin who was a virgin." Usually this kind of translation looseness didn't make much difference. Literary style aside, the meaning of Genesis 24:16 remains pretty much the same whether Rebekah is a young woman who is a virgin or a virgin who is a virgin. But of course, there is one case in which the difference between virgin and young woman is huge, and that is when she is pregnant. Unfortunately, the loose character of the translation in the Septuagint, which allowed virgin in Greek for what was young woman in Hebrew, was made even worse by the translators' inattention to context. So they didn't take into account the woman's pregnancy when they translated the word describing her. And the Greek ended up inadvertently making a virgin pregnant in Isaiah 7:14. Then the New Testament quoted the line, in Greek of course, ensuring the continued centrality of a translation mistake. Other ancient Greek translations use the more accurate Greek word neonis, young woman, in Isaiah 7:14. But we don't know if their authors did so trying to be more accurate or advancing an agenda to downplay the virgin birth. It is apparent that some tradition arose in early Christianity about an interpretation of Isaiah 7:14 as referring not only to Jesus, but also about the Greek parthenos of the verse, a mistranslation of the original Hebrew. But that tradition was a later accretion to the Jesus legend that does not appear to have an early origin. We can claim this for a number of reasons. The virgin birth is absent from our earliest Christian sources, the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Mark. Mark's Gospel lacks any sort of birth narrative as exists in Matthew and Luke, and no mention is made throughout his story of this miraculous conception. Paul's letters, too, make no reference to this tradition, even though he had opportunity to relay it if it had been known to him. He writes in his epistle to the Galatians that when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. Here, Paul refers to Jesus' birth as merely to that of a woman. The Greek word he uses is not even parthenos, but the even more generic and common gune, which can refer to any woman of any age, whether unmarried, married, or widowed. In reference to Jesus' mother, Paul makes no distinction between her and any other woman who had given birth in a natural way. And yet, we have evidence that Paul passed on other traditions which apparently were already circulating in the early church, such as the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, as well as the post-resurrection appearances. But here, where he has opportunity again to relay one of these traditions, if it were indeed true and went back to a historical Jesus, he merely states, almost offhandedly and most matter-of-factly and unextraordinarily instead, that Jesus was simply born of a woman. Apologists may object that this is just another skeptical argument from silence, that simply because Paul does not write about the virgin birth, that doesn't mean he didn't know about it. Alternatively, some apologists may argue that Paul did not mention the virgin birth because it was already known to his audience, and there was no need to restate something that they already knew. However, it's not simply that Paul fails to mention the virgin birth in any of his letters. It's the fact that when he does mention the birth of Jesus, it's merely to an indistinct woman, as in Galatians 4, and not specifically to a virgin, as one would expect should he have known of the legend. The most parsimonious explanation for why Paul fails to mention Jesus' birth to a virgin when given an opportunity to restate such a tradition, especially when we know Paul relayed other traditions about Jesus, it's because he simply didn't know of any such tradition, either because it had not reached him yet, or because it was yet to be invented by later Christians. A bigger problem arises when we consider that Jesus' closest family members seem to be unaware, in the other two gospel accounts of Mark and John, of this miraculous birth, which heralded in this remarkable man's life. In Mark 3:21, after the gospel reports of Jesus' preaching, healing, and casting out demons in his home region of the Galilee, gathering large crowds to him, when his family heard of it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying he has gone out of his mind. For a family that experienced and grew up around the supposed miraculous circumstances of his birth, including birth to a virgin, this is extremely strange behavior. His own brothers, who surely grew up hearing the stories of the manger, or was it a house? The flight to Egypt, or was it just a return to Nazareth? The wise men with their expensive gifts, or were there only poor shepherds, didn't even believe in him. In John 7, verses 1 through 5, we read, "After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He did not wish to go about in Judea because the Jews were looking for an opportunity to kill him. Now the Jewish festival of booths was near, so his brothers said to him, 'Leave here and go to Judea, so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one who wants to be widely known acts in secret. If you do these things, show yourself to the world.' For not even his brothers believed in him." However, the context of Isaiah 7:14 is the strongest witness we have that speaks against this so-called prophecy referring to Jesus. Most scholars agree that this section of Isaiah was written in reference to current events, namely, when Judah was under threat from a coalition of forces from Damascus in Syria, under leadership of King Rezin, and Samaria in Israel, the northern kingdom called Ephraim in Isaiah, led by King Pekah, to join up with them against the Assyrians. The king of Judah, Ahaz, did not want any part of this alliance, and so the coalition was threatening attack. Fearing his total annihilation, Ahaz turned to Assyria itself for help. The Assyrians did indeed come to his aid, but as a price, Judah wound up as an Assyrian colony. But what Ahaz needed right as the Syrian-Ephraim forces gathered to attack was a clear sign of success, and the context of Isaiah 7 is explicit enough to prove this true. The verse itself supplies the context of present circumstances. As the New Revised Standard translates the verse, "Look, the woman is with child." This present tense is also reflected in other translations of the text, including Young's literal, "Lo, the virgin is conceiving." Young's literal is able to maintain the translation of the Hebrew Alma as virgin, as was the case for the Septuagint, but clearly in the context of present circumstances, and not as a future miracle. It is clear that this is merely the young woman's first conception, her first child, and it is occurring at the same hour Isaiah is prophesying to Ahaz. Not only did the prophecy state that a young woman is already with child, or at a minimum soon to bear one, but the chapter goes on to state that, before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose 2 kings you are in dread will be deserted. Right away, we see this reference isn't about the woman. As Walter Brueggemann notes in his commentary on Isaiah, the woman seems incidental for the sign, for it is the child and not the woman that claims attention. Brueggemann notes, the Isaiah passage per se has no interest in the virginal status of the woman. It is not interested because the focus is not on the birth, but on the child. But the verse isn't interested in the child as such either, but instead uses the child as a measuring tool. As Brueggemann has written, the function of the child is to monitor the time of the current threat of the northern neighbors, a time that will be short indeed. It is conventionally reckoned that a child knows the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, by 2 years of age. Thus, by 2 years of age, that is, by 2 years from the moment of utterance by the prophet, the two kings, Rezin and the son of Ramallah, will be terminated. That is, the threat noted in verses 7 through 9a, which preoccupies the king, is a short-term danger and should not be taken as seriously as does the king. In other words, the prophet is saying that there is a woman who will give birth to a child, and before this child reaches a certain age, the following things will happen, and happen to the land before whose two kings you, Ahaz, are in dread. Some apologists have tried to argue that the you in the verse is a reference to the entire house of David, and thus is looking beyond the present circumstances of Ahaz. In this way, the prophecy could be a reference to Mary and Jesus. The opening of this particular part of the prophecy in verse 13 reads as follows, Then Isaiah said, Hear now, you, house of David. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. However, such apologetics conveniently ignore 11 verses earlier, in verse 2, where the same use of the phrase house of David is used clearly in reference to Ahaz himself. Now the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim, so the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken, as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. Ahaz was the house of David. Referring to the house of David was merely another way of referring to royalty. As biblical scholar Joseph Blankensop notes regarding verse 13 in his commentary on Isaiah, the sign is addressed to Ahaz as representative of the royal Davidic house. If the prophecy of the child to be born was intended to be about Jesus, what care would Ahaz have had of some child to be born centuries later in the backwater town of Nazareth, with Assyrians and northern Israelites beating their swords on his doorstep? The prophecy to Ahaz continues describing events that are to occur before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, that is, before the child is about 2 years old. The Lord will bring on you and your people and on your ancestral house such days as have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. On that day, a day before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, in other words, within 2 years of the time this prophecy was spoken, the Lord was to bring the king of Assyria to Ahaz, ushering in such days as had not been seen since the northern kingdom of Israel split from the southern kingdom of Judah. Ahaz was long dead by the time Jesus was born, much less old enough to begin to learn the difference between good and evil. The Assyrian Empire itself had ceased to exist by the time of Jesus' birth, so how could the Lord have brought the king of Assyria to anyone in the 1st century CE? On that day, the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the sources of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. This verse is simply saying that on that day, again while Ahaz is still alive, centuries before Jesus' birth, God will call out the forces of Egypt and Assyria, and they will all come and settle in the steep ravines, and in the clefts of the rocks, and on all the thorn bushes, and on all the pastures. On that day, and so on and so forth, with more predictions on what will happen on that day. On that day before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. All of these events are to happen to Ahaz, and had nothing whatsoever to do with Jesus of Nazareth, a Galilean to be born centuries in the future. Brueggemann summarizes the prophecy. Thus the woman, the named child, and the time all converge to offer the king assurances that may override his panic and his dangerous misreading of military political reality. Isaiah issues an offer of well-being that the king cannot accept. King Ahaz comes to represent in the tradition of Isaiah not simply a weak, vacillating king, but Judah in its unfaith, Judah in its disregard of Yahweh. Ahaz refuses God with us. Ahaz proceeds to live and conduct policy minus Yahweh. From a Yahwistic prophetic perspective, of course, such a decision is a disaster. The proper context of this prophecy exposes the error in attributing it to Jesus. The child which was to be born and measured against was a child of the 8th century BCE, hundreds of years before Jesus' own birth. The authors of Matthew and Luke simply had this wrong regarding the proper contextual interpretation of Isaiah 7 when they wrote their Gospels late in the 1st century CE, and have been placing apologists in an embarrassing position trying to defend their use of the Isaiah prophecy ever since. Not only this, but as the Gospels were written, a standard Greco-Roman theme in mythology of the miraculous births of semi-divine heroes permeated popular culture. The founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, were believed to have been the product of a union between the god Mars and a mortal woman. Historical figures like Plato, Alexander the Great, and the Emperor Augustus had stories about them and their own miraculous births. And the notion of children coming to women who should not otherwise be able to conceive was not unknown in the Hebrew scriptures themselves. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, received a divine miracle in the conception of Isaac, having been barren her entire life and having lived well beyond the age to have children. Similar stories exist for Rebekah and Rachel too. Combine this popular Greco-Roman mythological theme and presence of a similar notion in the Hebrew scriptures with the Gospel's penchant for interpreting Old Testament passages as prophetic and relevant to the story of Jesus, and especially their author's exposure only to the Greek Septuagint version of the scriptures with its mistranslation of the Hebrew Alma, and you have a rather parsimonious explanation for the virgin conception found only in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. And yet again, as we've seen with the other so-called fulfilled prophecies cited by Dutko, where does he get the evidence that Jesus even met this expectation of a virgin birth supposedly predicted in the Bible? From no other source than the Bible itself. No external evidence exists to corroborate the claims of the Gospel authors that Jesus really was born of a virgin. So Dutko fails to support his assertion by engaging, yet again, in nothing more than circular argumentation. How is the Bible proven true by assuming the truth of the Bible at the outset? Funding for this program was provided in part by the generous contributions of viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you.